Hi, everybody. The purpose of this lecture will be to take you through the Cuban Revolution, from basically Castro's early days all the way to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, and it's going to be one of the longer lectures that I do, really, for the essential new learning, Cuba, and then the dirty wars in Argentina. Aside from like basic Cold War theory, or the things that we decided to focus on in Latin America. There'll be like a little bit from Europe as well. So it'll be longer. It'll probably take 2 days to listen to, or two 25-minute increments worth of time to listen to, however you want to do it, stuff along that. And it'll also be kind of fairly detailed, and I'll try to take time to explain like a number of different things to you, et cetera, throughout the course of it, way more so than some of the other ones have been. Now, I'll say this to begin with. What you're looking at is a picture of Havana. You're looking at Havana, the city of Havana, from the cliffs kind of right outside of it, where actually the presidential palace had been, and then where Fidel and Che lived after they took control, and actually where a number of the Revolutionary Tribunal and executions took place. And then the photo is kind of shot from that place looking over to the city of Havana or so there. And then on the right, you see the Cuban flag in the Museum of the Revolution. I will say this, almost nowhere more than anywhere else that we study in class do I feel that actually going and seeing the things matters so much. The amount of detail, the amount of intricacies, stuff like that I can talk about Cuba, actually having been to Havana and stuff like that, increases significantly. And I'm not saying this to prop up this lecture. I'm saying this to say, this is why you always travel and go see the stuff. By all means, as soon as we're done with COVID-19, get back out in the world and travel. I cannot wait to feel the beach of Havana on my feet again. I swear, as corny as that sounds. Okay, I'm done with my shameless plug. On to the revolution here. Actually, I lied. Let's check out Havana a little bit more, because Havana is a pretty cool city. And it's also very, very different from anything you guys have experienced before. For example, if you look at the thing on the left, that's a place called the Malecon. It's one of the main strips in Havana. And one thing you might notice is that that's one of the main strips in Havana, and there is one car. That is because thanks to the U.S. Embargo of Cuba and stuff like that, the island pretty much looks like it was frozen in the 1950s or so. As a matter of fact, if you do get a car, what you generally get in Cuba are these 1950s style, brightly colored cars that you can see up on the top right there, the pink and the purple and the blue. I took that picture right when we got into Havana and looked out on the street. Those cars will cost about $30,000, but to be honest, you can make way more money driving people around in Havana, because cars are scarce and tourists and stuff like that. Way more money as a taxi driver than you can, say, a doctor under communist society, and plenty of people will quit their jobs once they've saved up enough money to buy a car and then just kind of drive taxis and stuff like that. Down below, you see a picture of Matheny standing there with a statue to Ernest Hemingway. The Floridita, which is one of the main bars in Cuba. Havana was the most popular hangout for rich white Americans prior to the Cuban Revolution. And so people like Hemingway, members of the mob, stuff along those lines, and I should say rich white American East Coasters prior to the Revolution. And the race part did matter. There were a number of clubs that were exclusive to white people, et cetera, et cetera. But Hemingway had a house down there and loved it, and so there's Matheny posting or posing next to it. You also see a picture of Estadio Latinoamericano, which is one of the most famous baseball stadiums outside of the United States. Despite the fact that the United States and Cuba might have creative differences at this point, they actually have a history of being very close to each other, and one thing that they do share is a very, very big love of baseball. I had the chance to go to a game between Industriales and Cienfuegos Elefantes while I was there, and it was very interesting and a lot of fun, but also a very, very, very different experience than an American baseball game. Okay, a few more pictures of Havana, and then I promise you we will get into the revolution here. Um, Up at the top left, you can see the very famous Cuban cigars. That is the one thing that Cuba seems to have retaliated with the U.S. embargo. I'm not a cigar person and didn't even try a Cuban cigar when I was down there, but I'm told they're impressive and taste really good and stuff like that. Churchill was a big fan. On the left, you can see what kind of a Cuban neighborhood in Havana looks like. The brightly colored painted houses. Havana is actually one of the oldest cities in the Americas. It was founded in the 1500s, and it has a very European feel, as you can see up in the bottom part right there. That's one of the main squares of Old Town Havana, as you would expect in a country that has some economic problems like Cuba. The main square in Old Town Havana and the places that the cruise ships come off and stuff like that, along with the hotels are really nice, and then other parts aren't. As Americans, Matheny and I actually had to stay in the equivalent of an Airbnb because U.S. law prevents people from staying in any hotel because any Cuban hotel gives money to the government, and so you can get in trouble for doing that. But if you go in something called Support the Cuban People, where you stay at the equivalent of an Airbnb, and you also do some charity stuff, like for example, we bought clothes and stuff like that down there to like Cuban aid relief, then it's perfectly acceptable and legal to go to Havana. But that did mean we were off the beaten path a little bit, and so we got to see some of the neighborhoods that weren't quite as dressed up for like the cruise boat tourists and stuff along those lines. Speaking of the mainstream part of Havana, that part in the middle is the Hotel Nacional, and it's one of the more famous hotels in the world. They've got this great area where you can see what everybody ate when they were there, and everybody and their little brother throughout history has stayed at this hotel. I'm partial to Cuban mob stories, so that's a picture of mob boss Lucky Luciano and what he did, as well as some pictures of Babe Ruth and Ted Williams, and when they were down in Havana at that time. Above, you see this great artistic area of Havana called Foosterland, and over to the right, you can see these gorgeous big like fig tree things that fall down in the Caribbean, as you may have seen before, particularly in Cuba, out if you're just kind of in like the parks of Havana. The last thing I want to show you before we get into the actual like academic part of this, and this is why I told you this lecture would probably take a couple days because I had things I wanted to show you and go in detail and stuff like that, is revolutionary Havana here. And some of this you've probably seen before. For example, that picture on the left with Che in Revolutionary Square in Havana is fairly famous, with him on the side of the building there. Actually, opposite him on the other side, coincidentally on the Ministry of Information, as a classic communist place would have it, is a picture of Camilo Cienfuegos, another hero of the revolution. Matheny thinks that looks weirdly like the Ayatollah. I disagree. That's a cowboy hat and a long beard, but that's another story for another time. In the middle is a statue to Jose Marti. You might remember him, guys, from the first Cuban Revolution in 1896 that we talked about very, very briefly. I literally did one slide on it, but I talked about how Jose Marti founded something called the Our America movement, and he basically put forward the idea that Latin Americans should stop being slaves to North American and European culture and history and ideas and create their own unique and vibrant culture. And Castro always said Marti was the hero of the revolution, and as I'll get to, you can't, he's big in Cuba, I'll put it that way. Down on the bottom, when you look more at kind of revolutionary Cuba here, we've got various things that say the Committee to Defend the Revolution. You've got various signage in there that has pictures of Raul and picture of Fidel that go in every Cuban shop that you're in. Down on the bottom right, you see a mural that was painted by that area in that area called Foosterland that I showed you last slide, that has all the key revolutionaries coming across to land for the Cuban Revolution. And down on the bottom left, which I just found fascinatingly ironic and interesting coming from the United States, there were all these signs that said, "Thanks for everything, Fidel," just all over Havana, including when you walked into the Museum of the Revolution and stuff along those lines. Okay. Let's actually talk what we're going to argue about here, okay? And that is this, and I am just going to read this thesis straight up, okay? The new economic imperialism post-World War II by the United States, coupled with the poverty of the lower classes in Latin America, caused a really idealistic Fidel Castro and Che to embrace their own personal brand of Marxism. As we'll get to, it's not even really Castro, it's really Che and Raul. Castro was never a communist, he just really kind of hated the United States. But the power of the United States and what it had done historically throughout Latin America with the Roosevelt corollary and it being our sphere of influence had led to a number of places not seeing the United States as a benevolent power, but rather kind of an oppressive power, if that makes sense. And the poverty coupled with the United States' new position of power in the Cold War led to Che and Fidel and people like that to kind of rebel. When implemented, this upset the United States, seeing as a threat to the ethos of the Truman Doctrine, and led to a massive extension of the Cold War across the Atlantic and into Latin America. While it had started with stuff, as you know about, with Che's motorcycle diaries, that was kind of the beginning of the lower classes and seeing the poverty and stuff like that, and the beginning of the Cold War in Latin America with the Banana Republic and Guatemala and kind of the U.S. overthrow of a legally elected government in order to put a government that was more preferable to the United States in. The Cold War was in Latin America in full force. And like this is when like it hit everybody, not just the policy wonks, not just the people, but like bam, all of a sudden the Cold War is 90 miles off the coast of Florida in what had historically been one of the United States' closest allies, Cuba. To understand the revolution and why it was so important and the problems behind it, we need to actually start a little bit before the revolution, as you usually do in these type of things. And let's begin with like the ties that I've hinted at. First thing you should know is that Cuba may have had the closest ties by far. The closest ties by far of any Latin American nation to the United States. But what I would say about this, having been all over the Caribbean and over Latin America and to Cuba and stuff like that, is that its cultural vibe is decidedly Latin American and not Caribbean. Cuba is not just a small island in the Caribbean. It is a large island in the Caribbean that takes several hours to traverse one side of the other and stuff like that, just as large as a number of European states and stuff along those lines. And historically, because of the sugar and rum trade, at least for the upper echelons of Cuban society, which were always very white compared to the lower echelons, which were either mixed or black or something along those lines. And that is important because the race card is going to factor really hardcore into the Cuban Revolution, what people look like, who decides to support them, etc., etc. Historically, the upper echelons, the whitest parts of Cuban society, have been just as rich as other parts of Latin America and the United States and stuff along those lines. Okay. Now, by 1940, Cuba is run by a dictator by the dude by the name of Fulgencio Batista. Okay, I'll show you a picture of him in a second. He's the one that I hinted at before that FDR famously said, he may be a bastard, but he's our bastard. Okay, and that actually sums up Batista pretty well. He'd overthrown the previous dictator, ran for an election and won, and actually when he finishes his term, I think it's in 46, maybe 48, one of the two, he actually is like, okay, cool, I'm going to go into retirement, I've skimmed a lot of money off the top, nobody hates me too much, I'll leave, I'll go to the U.S., etc., etc. Problem is for some reason he gets the policy bug again, or the I want more money bug, and I want to corrupt and abuse an island bug, and so he decides to go back and run for election again in 1952. Right before the election's about to happen, he realizes that he's not going to win this election, okay? And so instead, he stages a coup, takes control, and suspends the Constitution. He does this again with the tacit backing of the United States, because although he cracks down on civil rights and habeas corpus and stuff like that, he also, quote-unquote, cracks down on communism and calls people he doesn't like communists, and in the throes of the beginning of the Cold War, like it's just starting in 52, right? And then what will become Operation Condor and stuff like this, this is huge for the United States. The other thing he does is he allows U.S. companies to return and operate to make money, and he receives tons of aid from the United States. He has a horrible record on human rights, though. Now, I will say this, how poor is a little bit up for debate, because the revolution has, like, biasly skewed how much they hate Batista. To be honest, he is, like, public enemy #1 for, like, Castro and company. If you look on the left and right, you can see pictures of Batista right there. In the middle is the presidential palace that Batista had in the middle of Havana. The presidential palace is now the Museum of the Revolution, but they tried to keep it in, like, you know, really good shape in order to show, oh my, look at the, like, luxury that Batista lived in when other people in Cuba were, like, poor and starving, etc., etc. And one of the most famous things that they won't let you take a picture of, you can find it online though, is there's a gold telephone, a gold-plated telephone that supposedly Batista used, and, like, Castro and company seized on that when they took over Havana, as a way of basically saying, like, oh my gosh, look at the decadence this man lived in. If you look on the bottom left, up on the top left of the bottom left picture, I know that's weird, you can see some bullet holes, because basically from 1952 on, from the time he took power, one of the great pastimes in Cuban history was to just go shoot up the presidential palace. You weren't going to really hit Batista and stuff like that, but Camilo Cienfuegos, who was part of the revolution, did it. Fidel did it a couple times. Frankie Pa did it, stuff like that, and it became like one of those things, and they left a number of those bullet holes in there to kind of commemorate the anti-Batista sentiment that went on really hardcore for a number of years in Cuba. The next two pages are flat out Cuban propaganda here. These are taken from a book that I bought in Havana at the Museum of the Revolution. The book is called Why the Cuban Revolution. And if we were in class, I'd actually pass it around and let you guys take a look at it and stuff like that. But it tries to explain in English from the pro-Castro current-day Cuban point of view, well, how bad Batista was and why they felt the need for this revolution to occur. And needless to say, it does it with, like, classic propaganda techniques. This is another couple pages from that, as you can see. Like, we forget nothing, showing the blood of everything, down with the dictatorship. One of the more fascinating things to do, having not really spent a lot of time in a country that puts forward that much kind of propaganda, was really to look through the Cuban Museum of the Revolution and stuff like that. And kind of see the very interesting things that came forward and get a couple books and stuff like that. And I'm not saying that this is wrong. As a matter of fact, there is a lot of evidence that, like, Batista did some horribly bad things, like busted heads and shirt stains and stuff like that. And a lot of these pictures aren't doctored, but the way it's put forward and the manner it's put forward, and also the, like, emphasis and stuff like that, is definitely, like, decidedly massively biased. I'll put it this way: we could OPCVL the ever-loving crap out of this. Now, meanwhile, the Castros, okay? This is the family from which these two brothers are going to come, the next two presidents of Cuba. As a matter of fact, the current president of Cuba is a man by the name of Miguel Diaz-Canel. He became president in 2018, right before Matheny and I went to the island. He was the first person since 1959 without the last name of Castro to be in charge of Cuba. So that gives you an idea. Okay? Now, they're two brothers, Fidel and Raul. Fidel tended to be the older one. Or, sorry, no, didn't tend to be the older one. Fidel was the older one. He tended to be the leader, is what I was trying to say. Now, having said that, it was Raul who was ideologically communist, okay? Fidel really was not, for the most part. Fidel was ideologically anti-American, but it was Raul and Che that were ideologically communist that kind of, like, put forward, like, a lot of the ideas that became Cuba under communism. It was really interesting to see in Cuba, because if you'd asked me prior to going to Cuba, I would have said the three most important people were Raul, Fidel, and then Che. But the way it was put forward in Cuba, for the most part, really minimized Raul's role in favor of people like Camilo Cienfuegos and Juan Almeida and stuff like that, to basically put him, like, as, like, the fourth or fifth most important person, not the third or so. Anyway, this is definitely an upper-class sugar-growing family. Fidel studied law in the 1940s. They both went to school. They were both highly educated. Fidel and Che and Raul used to stay up playing chess, debating various, Enlightenment philosophies, and then, like, post-industrialist philosophies and stuff along those lines. I mean, these are a bunch of academic dorks, hardcore, okay? When he was in law school, Fidel became very mildly socialist, but really what he was anti-imperialistic and nationalistic, okay? The combination of which, being Cuban in the 1940s, led to anti-American. If you're anti-imperialist and you're very pro-Cuban and nationalist, you become very anti-American, and that's become really, really, really important deciding factor in Fidel Castro's decisions in life. Okay, to give you an idea, he's even going to travel to Colombia in 1948 to protest the formation of the Organization of American States, and he got particularly upset when Batista took power because he saw him as a tool of the United States and an imperialist bastard. There's a lot of bastards being thrown around involving Batista. I'm not exactly sure why that term got chosen all the time, but it did. Here you can see a picture of a very young Fidel Castro protesting very futilely, it looks like, actually, outside of Batista's palace in the early, 1950, yeah, in the early 1950s or so. So there's young Fidel for you. He's got the pedigree and the, like, protest history behind him to be the leader here. He also has, in every book I've ever read about Fidel, an amazing amount of either bravado or distorted perception of reality or just complete and total confidence. But I mean, it's like, 12 people land on Cuba and Fidel's comment is, sweet, we've won the revolution. And everybody else is like, what the bleep are you talking about? We still have a lot to do. And Fidel's like, no. We're going to win this thing, I promise. And that seems to kind of been Fidel for you, which might explain some of the next few actions here. In 1953, after Batista has taken power in the illegal coup, the one where he wasn't going to win the presidency, so then he did a coup in order to take the presidency. The Castro brothers form an anti-Batista group that they creatively named the Movement. As a matter of fact, they eventually, the date July 26th becomes important in the formation, as well as a few other key dates in that, and it becomes the Movement of July 26, or the July 26 Movement, or 26M7 as it's often abbreviated, like the Movement of July 26. But anyway, they form this thing called the Movement, okay? They then, with the Movement, they lead a failed attack on the Cuban Army's Moncada barracks, okay, which is in the middle of the island. This is nowhere near Havana or Santiago de Cuba, which is on the other side of the island, which is Cuba's kind of second city. It's actually just this kind of remote place. So it's really kind of interesting that they choose it for that reason, because it's not like you're going to get like the people living in the cities who don't like Batista with you. But the goal was to get the army to rebel with them. The idea was if they attacked the Moncada barracks, okay, in 53, that after they'd gotten in there and they'd, Fidel and people had given a few, like, fiery speeches to the army, they'd understand how awful Batista was, and they'd side with the Castro's movement, and bam, that would be it. But, of course, the army has the money, and the army has the power, and the army has the guns, and they don't. And instead it becomes a complete and total debacle, and the Castro brothers are arrested, and this should have been the end of everything, because, in most of the world, when you, commit rebellion or treason and fail, that is the end of you. But Batista makes a really, really, really big mistake now, okay? Instead of going after the Castro brothers in court, he tries to pin the revolt on his political enemies, okay? Who are way bigger, in his opinion, than the Castro brothers at that point, okay? These are people that actually had power, not just some upstart farmers, but people who had power he didn't agree with. He arrests them, he tortures them, they confess, etc., etc., okay? Now, Batista still has to put in, like, some semblance of democracy or, like, civilization or society here. So, like, Castro does have a trial. And he gives Castro the chance to speak, which historically is a bad move, because Fidel might be one of the most long-winded individuals in the history of humanity. Okay, I was reading right before I started this lecture, just brushing up on stuff like that, about a 7.5-hour speech he gave at one of the revolutionary tribunals after, like, the Cuban Revolution was, like, over and stuff like that, okay? And that was long, but, like, this guy could talk, and he could go, and he could get up there and just go forever and ever and ever, okay? And so Castro is given the opportunity to speak at trial, and he does a few key things. First of all, he exposes that Batista, like, tortured a bunch of people in this, and it uses this for his political enemies, etc., etc. Two, he cites Jose Marti as the real father of the revolution. Marti's Our America speech becomes the basis for it. Fidel quotes large parts of it while talking at the same time here. This is his, like, legal training in action, right? And says, Marti is the real father of the revolution. And the main argument that Fidel makes from a legal standpoint is this: it couldn't have been a coup because Batista took power illegally anyway. And since Batista took power illegally anyway, then, like, trying to overthrow illegal power is not illegal, which the judge kind of buys into. And the end result is that the Castro brothers are sentenced to 15 years in prison / an insane asylum, depending on your point of view, because they're moved a couple times and people say they're insane and stuff like that. While Batista's, like, current political enemies that are right there are indisposed, there's all sorts of, like, people, like, fomenting with the Castros and stuff like that. Attacks on his palace become very, very common. Attacks on him become common during this time. This actually, like, hurts Batista significantly once Castro's argument is put forward to the Cuban people here. These are a couple statues of Jose Marti I wanted you to see. The one on the horse is the death of Marti. He's died in the Cuban Revolutionary battles of 1896 or so. And the one on the left is kind of more a modernist statue of Marti right outside the Cuban Museum of the Revolution. The airport is named after Marti. My running joke by the time I was there long enough is you almost cannot turn around in Havana without bumping into some type of tribute or statue to Jose Marti. It is absolutely insane. I remember walking to the baseball stadium and just, like, we're on a corner and I'm like, wait, there's a statue. Oh, yep, there's a little bust of Marti. Okay, yep, that's exactly what I expect. Turn around. Yep, one on the other side. It almost kind of reminds me of, like, Starbucks in Seattle. I mean, they are literally on almost every corner. It's a tribute thing to somebody who existed a long time ago that I really haven't ever seen before. It was really kind of fascinating. Now that we're ready to actually start the revolution here, let's get to know the main players here, okay? The guy on the upper left is Fidel, okay? That is Fidel in his glory right here. You'll notice all of these guys have beards, all of them have fatigues. They spend an incredible amount of time in the mountains of the Sierra Maestra in army uniforms. We'll get to that story in 1 second, okay? The guy in the middle, in between them, the smallest picture up there, that guy is Juan Almeida. He represents the Afro-Cuban or like black Cuban population that was key in this, and he's going to be really, really instrumental in like getting large swaths of the Cuban population into the movement, okay? The guy on the right there, that is Raul. That is Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother and eventual president of Cuba. The guy on the bottom left is Camilo Cienfuegos, the guy in the cowboy hat. He is going to become probably the most popular and loved member of the movement. He's very famous also because of the compassion he held when he, like, for example, he captured revolutionaries. A lot of people would execute him. Camilo Cienfuegos would not. He'd show mercy, stuff along those lines. He was killed in a plane crash under mysterious circumstances in 1960. People have said that it was anything from the CIA to an accident to Fidel actually killing him because he was upset at Camilo's popularity. And then finally, the dude smoking the cigar in the center is Che Guevara, as you guys probably have figured out from your research and work into him. Okay, just to be clear, Fidel and Che are probably the two most important. After that, Cienfuegos, Raul, and Almeida kind of below them or so. So the pictures aren't necessarily in order. It's just the way that it looked good. But these are the like main guys of the Cuban Revolution that you need to be aware of in order to fully understand it here. This is just a picture of a building taken in Havana that we just found interesting, or I found interesting, because you find these on all sorts of buildings all over Havana, kind of like the Marty statues I was saying everywhere. If you look, that's Raul on the left. This is from left to right. Camilo Cienfuegos in the center, and Che on the right, just to give you an idea of kind of the important revolutionaries that you'll find all over Havana here. In 1955, in what's supposed to be a show of dictatorial benevolence, Batista releases the Castro brothers and he sends them into exile, and they go into exile in Mexico City. Okay, and this is Castro's second time, and it's only going to take 2 tries for Castro to get this right, albeit slightly by accident, but he does. Now, as luck would have it, if you did your work on from yesterday, you remember reading about Che in Guatemala. And after the revolution in Guatemala, Che also went to exile, and that was in Mexico City. Here, Che is in some type of shop, a coffee shop, a sandwich shop. You can decide whatever works better for you, but you get the overarching point behind it here. And Raul walks into this shop, okay? And this is reason number like 827 that Guns, Germs, and Steel is BS. You can't just make this stuff up, because in the shop they get to meet each other, they start talking, and Raul says, hey, I really kind of like your ideas and stuff like that. You know, you should meet my brother. He takes him back to meet Fidel, and bam, through the coincidences of history, Raul, Fidel, and Che have all met in Mexico City. And there they find other exiled forces. As a matter of fact, they find other really important Cuban exiles, 82 of them, okay? The vast majority of them, the really important ones, names we don't really care about for the most part, because these guys are going to invade 82 of them, and the vast majority of them are going to be captured and killed. So the ones that become important are the ones that actually manage to survive. Che survives, Raul survives, Fidel survives, and then people like Camilo Cienfuegos or Juan Almeida, who I told you earlier about, who are like very kind of like 2-bit players at this point, are going to become major players in the Cuban Revolution solely because of the coincidence of this landing here. So it's there that they join forces with like big Cuban exiles, people that like Batista was very much scared of, as well as like at the time smaller Cuban exiles like Cienfuegos or Almeida or stuff like that, who will become big Cuban exiles later. Okay. They raise enough money, they scrape together enough money in Mexico City, and they plan this invasion of Cuba, that they're going to invade Cuba, but they need a ship to do it, so they scrape together enough money to purchase a decrepit yacht. Okay, the irony of this, the yacht part of it, with a bunch of communists and revolutionaries and stuff like that, is massive and actually lost on nobody. Okay? And actually, in the Museum of the Revolution, you can find that yacht, the Granma, as it is right there. This is the Granma Memorial in the Museum of the Revolution. Don't worry, I'll go back to that slide to continue to explain Castro's second time, but I want to just show you this picture so you get an idea there. This is a thing they all 82 of them came over and landed on. And they land in on the east coast of Cuba, kind of near the Sierra Maestra and kind of Santiago de Cuba, kind of away from Havana. They're going to land on this yacht in 1956. And when they get there, um, they're going to have been, I mean, because like there's a yacht and it's got 82 people, so like people in Mexico City knew about this. They hit problems going across the sea. People in Cuba saw about it. People sold out and told Batistas about it, people about it, etc., etc. So like the landing of the Grandma, and yes, for those of you wondering, that literally means like the grandma. Okay, right? The landing of the Grandma is not what we would really consider to be like the most, oh, I don't know, best amphibious, one of the better amphibious landings in history. This is not D-Day by any means whatsoever. What I'm getting at is this, is that of the 82 idealist invaders that land, all but 12 of them are captured or killed within the first few hours. And that says up there this reason. So in 1896, in the Cuban Revolution, there were 12 people that started the revolution to take over Cuba, supposedly, right? There are also, Cuba, you might remember, has Latin American influence, is a religious country, and has strong Catholic ties, and there are 12 disciples. And so the story has always been that there are 12 people that make it off the Grandma and in there, and 12 people that like start this revolution to take over, and that's lost on nobody, the importance of 12, etc., etc. However, and that's what the parentheses on the slide is, standing at the tour guide, standing in Havana talking to one of my tour guides about this, and he's talking about the 1896 revolution, and I say, oh, wait, so on 2 separate times, Cuba was taken over by 12 different people? And he deadpans looks at me and goes, or 13, or 15, but 12 is a better story. That just gives you an idea about history, the telling of history, the retelling of history. To quote J.R.R. Tolkien, on one of my all-time favorite quotes, every good story deserves a little embellishment. So we're going to go with 12, because even though it could be 13 or 15, 12 is a way better story. Okay? The remaining ones make their way into the mountains of the Sierra Maestra, and they basically play, if you can imagine this, a 3-year-long game of hide and seek, okay? It is like guerrilla forces here and guerrilla forces there, and there's like, you know, some bombings, and then they move, and then they get like, you know, 2 farmers to help them, and then they move, and then they take out like 60 of Batista's forces, and then they move a little bit. And at one point, for example, like Che is outnumbered 10-1 at the Battle of Santa Clara and executes a bunch of kind of guerrilla tactics that like manage like to give to kind of split the island and slowly give him the advantage, and then a number of people join in with him, and actually he ends up winning despite the fact he's outnumbered 10-1 in one of the more studied pieces of modern military like guerrilla history, right? At the Battle of and I'm sure I'm saying this wrong, Yajue, Camilo Cienfuegos, for example, is able to lead a guerrilla raid force with a bunch of Tommy guns. They just come in shooting like crazy and just wreck Batista's forces. And eventually what happens, after a lot of support from the peasant population, after guerrilla warfare, after slowly kind of like, you know, gnawing down at this over an extended period of time, the people, after and on top of that, after Batista's people doing like really bad PR things, like taking this other member of the movement who was really popular by the name of Frank Pa, P-A-I, and having him killed in 57 on the street, and then parading his body so everybody saw it, you know, and allowing Fidel to capitalize on that. And also, let's not note that like the media, or let's not forget that the media is a big deal here. The U.S. media finds Fidel fairly interesting. The United States had ties to this and bases at that point. There are actually a few Americans that run away from their military base and join the movement, which makes the media a big deal. NBC and CBS send reporters down into the Sierra Maestra, and Fidel gets on TV, and really for a little bit is kind of the darling of everybody's eye and stuff like that. On January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista tucktails and runs. He takes his family, he takes a few supporters, he takes as much money as he possibly can, and he runs first off to, I think he first tries to go to the United States, and then eventually makes his way to like Spain, Portugal, etc., like that area, blah, blah, blah. I think. I'm not going to plan to be an expert on where Batista ran to. I just remember that Batista tucktailed and run. Castro declares victory starting on the east coast of the island at Santiago de Cuba, and makes his way over to Havana, like kind of slowly like gaining steam as he goes. And like Cuba is under new leadership for the first time. And what type of leadership this looks like is a massively big deal and very much up for question, okay? Castro, as I said, is anti-American, but he's not massively communist. And so Che basically boils it down to three things. He said, Castro, you can suck it up and go with the U.S. and things will be great. You can listen to me and Raul, go with the USSR and things will be mostly okay. Or you can go at it alone, in which case you're going to fall back into an island of poverty that hates you as much as people hated Batista, etc., etc. Because Castro just could not stomach after his history, the option number one, he and Che are eventually, after a couple years and thinking and moving and stuff like this, going to basically side with the USSR hardcore, become communists, or in Castro's case, really anti-American, and take things through option number two. The picture you're looking at right there is actually Fidel and Camilo Cienfuegos declaring victory after the revolution on January 1st. And actually, it's fairly famous in Cuba because Fidel was not the best public speaker and got a little nervous and said, looked over and said, "How am I doing?" And Camilo said, "Don't worry, Fidel. You're doing great." And like Camilo was then like very much very popular as a result of that. In the bottom left, you can see because of his like kind of jovial attitude. In the bottom left, you can see a picture of Fidel and Che, or not a picture, a statue of Fidel, Che, and Camilo Cienfuegos in the mountains of Sierra Mistera in the Museum of the Revolution. These next few pictures, and that's what you're going to look at for a little bit here, is a few more pictures from the Museum of the Revolution, give you some idea of some of the stuff you can find in there. On the left is Fidel's fatigues that he spent the vast majority of time in the Sierra Mistera. I mean, these guys really didn't bathe, they didn't change clothes, they didn't shave, hence the reason they all have those things, those things, i.e. beards. They're actually going to become even known as the bearded ones, stuff like that. It was actually a little bit gross, to be honest, but they saved most of these things, or they at least saved old fatigues that they could pretend are these things. You can see Che's down below in the bottom right, down there, along with Che's signature for an execution warrant for one of the revolutionary tribunals, and Che's pipe, who, despite the fact that he was an asthmatic, loved to smoke a pipe from time to time and debate philosophy. In one of my more favorite examples of hero worship, though, in the entire Museum of the Revolution, is this. This is a wax statue, or wax models, of Che and Camilo Cienfuegos, the two people that died after the revolution, kind of as the martyrs, in the mountains of Sierra Mistera. Never mind, they didn't overly get along, nor ever really fight together, but like this is just a room in the museum that's like, you just walk in the room and then all you see is just this model of Camilo Cienfuegos and Che. And let's note that this is right before you walk into something that's literally called, and I'm not joking about this, the Hall of Che. So these are just pictures I thought you guys would find interesting to give you an idea of kind of how it's displayed in Cuba. Now, before we get into Castro under Cuba, I need to talk to you about this because there was this baseball game. So yeah, as I said, there's this baseball game, and this is the problem for those of you that are not sports people that you get when you have a teacher who used to be a sports reporter. I'm going to dork out for a couple seconds. They go into Havana, and, as I talked about earlier, one of the big pastimes in Cuba is baseball, and so somebody suggests that Fidel throw an inning. So Fidel and Camilo Cienfuegos and some of the other revolutionaries go out there in a jersey like this. The bearded ones are Barbados, and Fidel is the pitcher. Cienfuegos is the catcher. And yes, for those of you wondering at home, I am purposely doing with this so I can dork out and show you, as I have been all year, the various things that I wear that are thematically linked to what we've been doing in class. For those of you that missed, for example, me wearing a Socrates jersey when we do Socratic seminars and stuff like that, open your eyes a little bit more, look around, you might find something out. Anyway. They go out there, and Fidel apparently struck out the side on what was a very, very generous strike zone by all accounts. And this was actually one of the ways that the revolutionaries kind of introduced themselves to Cuba and the Cuban people. By the way, one more thing while I have y'all before we go back to
the actual lecture and stuff. Just as a heads up, this will give me an idea of how many of you are actually listening all the way through. Bill, I have one of your playing cards. Sometime throughout the course of the year when you were screwing around with playing cards and went to go to the bathroom, I decided to take one out of the deck just to see if you ever noticed and give you a deck of 51 and make you mess around with 51. So at some point, I owe you a playing card I was planning to give you back at the end of the year. It's sitting in the desk of the upper drawer. I think it's an ace of spades, or sorry, not ace of spades, an eight of spades, but I could be wrong. That's all. Back to the lecture.
There on the right is the actual picture of Fidel and Camilo Cienfuegos there, going out as the bearded ones. But baseball has actually been a weapon, or not weapon, a tool of diplomacy for the United States and Cuba since this revolution began. If you look on the bottom left, you can see Fidel when he visited the United States throwing out the first pitch with Jimmy Carter, who was president at the time then. And up on the top left up there is actually then President Barack Obama with then President Raul Castro, as Obama attended a game at the stadium I showed you guys earlier, Estadio Latinoamericano, sorry. Estadio Latinoamericano. Obama attended a game there in the early teens. I've forgotten the exact year. I remember our guides at the time had actually been able to go to that game, and it was, like they said at the time, one of the most popular things ever to occur in Cuba. Okay, now that we've had a little bit of fun with the universality of sport, let's actually talk about Cuba under Castro. By June of 1960, okay, so this is about 16 months into his, 18 months or so into his tenure, Castro is breaking down the Cuban economic structure to rebuild it. As a matter of fact, it's not necessarily Castro breaking down the Cuban economic structure, it's actually Che doing a large part of it, because of another one of the greatest coincidences of history, and this is why you should always pay full attention in class, kids. The story goes like this. There's a meeting with the leadership after this has happened. Okay, he's tired, he's not really paying attention, and Che's starting to fall asleep. Okay, Fidel, who is long-winded and speaks forever, is going down this, and Che's nodding off, and Fidel says, "So, is anybody here an economist?" Right? And Che, who's nodding off, thinks Fidel says, "Is anybody here a communist?" And so the story goes that Che raises his hand. "Yep, absolutely, I'm a communist." And Fidel says, "Sweet, you're an economist. In that case, you're in charge of Cuban economics." And that gets Che to be in charge of Cuban economics. Okay? Now, part of this economics right here, for a bit, not for long, it doesn't last for that long, right? Part of it's anti-imperialist. And necessary. Like other parts of Latin America, you had large swaths of the population owning no land and small swaths of the population owning tons of land. So that part, the land distribution, is kind of necessary. Other part of it really is because Fidel and Che are really kind of annoying the United States. There are United States companies there. One of the most famous, well, there are a bunch of United States companies there, like, for example, even things like Coca-Cola or like Pepsi or stuff like that. We went diving in Havana, outside of Havana, like scuba diving. That's one thing I love to do, if you don't know that about me. And one of the things to find down there, aside from like your normal fish and stuff like that, is you can find old things that say, like, Coca-Cola made in Havana, and it's from like 1940, because since 1959 American companies haven't been there. So that's what I was getting at, is they're gonna get rid of most American companies and nationalize and kick out things and stuff like that. Okay. They are going to take other companies that won't just give to the state. That's what I was saying with most famous. So like, for example, Bacardi rum and other rum and sugar companies and stuff like that. And they're going to have to either go to the United States or to other countries or stuff along those lines. This is very similar to what happened with like the oil companies in Mexico under the PRI, where they just, take over the plant and nationalize it and say, okay, you don't have private enterprise anymore. This is all now property of the state. Che creates a number of plans for economics, none of which are massively successful. The most successful is land reform and redistribution of farmland. Okay. The other one that is fairly successful is the Cuban educational system. Cuban literacy under Che goes from about 60% to about 96%. The other thing that Cuba is known for doing pretty well under this time and since then is the Cuban medical system. Cuba's doctors are very well trained, and like for its other standard of living. It has one of the highest comparative quality healthcare systems in the world. However, having said that, the economics are a complete and total disaster for the most part. Private enterprise is non-existent. I mean, even today when we were in Havana, there was just this defunct amusement park there, and Matheny, as a joke, said, okay, so what if I want to buy that and fix it up and like open it, and then like, you know, people can do it? And our guide was like, yeah, you can't do that. And she was like, what? He's like, they wouldn't let you do that. And we're like, wait, so even if we came to the government with $20 million, they wouldn't let us have a private? No, not at all. Not in the slightest. As a result, technology in Cuba has massive, massive issues today. I showed you earlier, like the picture that like had like, you know, one car on the street, but even with cell phones and stuff like that, the internet is only on at certain times. It's actually kind of fascinating from a tourist point of view. You can look at this and see this, and you can tell, okay, is the internet on? Well, the internet's not on. Why? Because everybody's talking to each other. Then you look down like an hour later, and okay, it looks like the internet's working here. Why? Because everybody's on their phones, right? This is why, on a quick side note, any of the like recent accusations that Cuba has done something to affect the United States from a technological standpoint are kind of comical, because the technology is just not there, right? So while like a few things work out fairly well, land reform, literacy, medicine, stuff like that, large other swaths like private enterprise, economics, technology work out very, very poorly. And because of the embargo, Cuba still has a number of issues today. This does not impact really the trajectory that Che and Fidel are going down in any way whatsoever. Fidel very famously comes to the United Nations and rips the U.S. in a 4.5-hour, I told you you liked long speeches, anti-imperialist speech, and makes the USSR Cuba's natural ally by this point. And if you didn't think the Cold War was in full force, it is by the time Fidel goes and does that at the United Nations, okay? And at this point, the United States has a reaction. They hadn't really done a whole lot before that. This is in the waning days of the Dwight Eisenhower administration. Last time we left U.S. politics, Harry Truman was president. We go through the beginning of the Cold War, the Korean War, and war hero Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, becomes president. And he's president from 1952 to 1960. So this is the tail end of that. Now, the Eisenhower administration responds by reducing Cuban imports. By 95%. This is a big, big, big economic hit, because the United States bought tons of sugar from Cuba. The USSR responds by just agreeing to buy 20% of all Cuban sugar in order to prop up the economy. And there's stories in like the 1980s of like warehouses in the USSR that just have a crap ton of sugar in them, because it's way more than anybody needs in the Soviet Union. But they promised to buy all this sugar, so they're just buying this sugar and they just keep it like to rot in a warehouse and stuff like that in order to basically like kind of prop up the economy. In late 1959, as I mentioned earlier, Cienfuegos' plane disappears mysteriously near Florida. There's a number of theories behind that, from it went down to the CIA to Fidel, etc., etc. At the very kind of tail end of his administration, right before the election of 1960, and probably as a way to kind of gain support, because the election of 1960 in the United States is hotly contested. It's between Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president, and an upstart Massachusetts senator by the name of John F. Kennedy. And in order to try to support Nixon here, Eisenhower administration places an embargo to all exports and imports from the island, aside from foodstuffs and medical stuffs. And this is the Cuban embargo that still exists today, from cars to Cuban cigars to stuff along those lines. Okay, as recently as like until the last 2 years, that even meant to like Major League Baseball only. In the last couple of years, has baseball worked out a thing where Cuba can actually like funnel players rather than having to do it secretly, where they sneak off an island and make it to Mexico and then get into the United States and stuff like that. Like only within the last few years have that changed, because one of my guides in Havana was very upset about that, because he said the end result is you're now draining Cuba of all its good baseball players. But that's a different story. That's how long the embargo has been on, is since 1960 or so. Imports are added later under that embargo with the Kennedy administration. Kennedy beats Nixon in that election to win, and just continues the embargo further. As a matter of fact, until the Obama administration, at basically every turn, the United States' reaction when dealt with Cuba was to further the embargo rather than to not further the embargo. The USSR responds by granting tons of low-interest loans and military aid, et cetera, to Havana, basically like bringing the Cold War in full force to the United States, to the United States' backyard, to within 90 miles of Florida, et cetera, okay? And the American response to this is a complete and total fiasco. It is something called the Bay of Pigs, okay? The CIA decides that enough is enough and that it's going to train people to invade and retake over the island of Cuba. The problem is that they literally just throw together, because this is like late 1950s racism at its height, right? A bunch of Latin American dissidents. They're like, oh, you're Latin American. Okay, so therefore you hate Fidel and you'll want to overthrow Cuba. It doesn't matter that you're Mexican or Guatemalan or I don't know, Brazilian or Argentinian, like just anybody who has any type of Hispanic-like roots and is a quote-unquote dissident in the eyes of the CIA is thrown together on this. The idea is that they'll land, and once the new Cubans see that they have support, the throngs of Cubans will overthrow Castro. The big problem is that those throngs never come because, to be honest, at this point, Castro is still fairly popular. He's only a year into his regime. People hated Batista. They hated the stuff that the United States had done under Batista, and like those throngs never come, and everybody is killed or captured within like 3 days. Some are eventually ransomed back to the United States. Right here you can see the propaganda against the Bay of Pigs invasion in the Museum of the Revolution. If you look on the top left, it gives you the composition, according to Cuba, of the Mercenary Brigade, 194 torturers and murderers of the Batista tyranny, 100 landowners of their descendants, 24 large landowners, 67 house owners, etc., basically saying these are like, enemies of the revolution who came in to do this. And then it shows you an idea of like, what it looked like when like the beaches of the fallen people, like during the Bay of Pigs and stuff like that. I need to take 1 second to entertain you with this story of these two tanks in the bottom left. On the front, you'll see the tank right there outside of the Museum of the Revolution is, according to the sign, the tank that Fidel Castro himself fired at during the Bay of Pigs fired at the U.S. invaders during the Bay of Pigs invasion. And then this tank to the left inside the Museum of the Revolution right there is, according to the plaque, the tank that Fidel Castro fired at the Bay of Pigs invaders with. I'm not joking about that, and I didn't say that wrong. The plaque actually says the same thing. This is why my 2 + 2 = 5 sign is right there. And it was a great example of like, I don't know, propaganda or like, truth bending or something along those lines. Matheny and King and I just kind of looked at each other like, wait, didn't we just see that tank a second? You know what? Okay, we're just going to run with it. As I said in the last slide, Kennedy is elected in 1960. That's him right there. I'm not going to go into Kennedy hardcore and Kennedy stories and stuff like that. You'll cover him in U.S. history plenty. But just suffice to say that his presidency, though fairly short, is very mixed. People have a lot of different thoughts and ideas on it. But he's going to be the president that has to deal with the major thing to come out of this, which is not even the Bay of Pigs, but something you've probably heard of called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tensions come to a boiling point in October of 1962. Now, we should note when I say this, this is really important, primarily for this reason. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit. You're going to talk about it a lot next year in U.S. history. Here's the reason. Most historians generally consider this to be the closest that the United States and USSR came to actual war during the Cold War, to flat-out war, which could have led to nuclear war, which could have led to God only knows what, right? That type of thing, okay? In 1962, United States reconnaissance planes take pictures of military installations going in Cuba. These are Soviet military rockets pointed at the United States, okay? The U.S. flips out. JFK goes on air and warns the American public that this is going on, this is a problem, blah, 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 what are we going to do? He gets the unanimous support of NATO and the OAS to say, oh my God, the Soviets are doing this. Never mind, and lost on this is the fact that we currently had missiles sitting in Turkey, which is a NATO country, just as close to the Soviet Union, pointed at them. Okay, all this really was kind of like a tit for tat thing on their part, but that's not really here nor there. The U.S. doesn't bring that up, is able to play the rest of the part up fairly well, and says, "Oh my God, look at what the USSR is doing. This is a crisis." Okay, the USSR, because the missile installations have started to go in. Okay, the USSR gets there with the missiles themselves, not the installations, and sees that the United States has blockaded the island. Okay, it becomes very, very, very close. Okay, to war here with like basically a standoff. Eventually, an agreement is reached. Okay, in which the USSR agrees to take the installments out of Cuba and back off. And the not the USSA, but sorry, the USA agrees not to try to invade the island again. Okay, crisis averted. The U.S. does not invade the island again. Eventually, missiles do go in, as you'll see on the next slide here. These are the actual like missiles that would have been there, or replicas there. That is in the Museum of the Revolution, like the replica there, and then that one right there is actually the like place that they wanted, the one on the top left, to point the missiles from out of Havana at the United States or so there. The line at the end is that we went eyeball to eyeball and they blinked first. As I said, you will talk about that a lot more next year. Okay, everybody, that's all I've got on the Cuban Revolution for you. Hopefully you enjoyed and learned something about it over the course of these last couple days or so. Tomorrow you'll spend a little bit of time doing just kind of a check-in for the week, and then we'll pop back to Europe for a little bit in the Cold War next week, and then get more into, by the end of that week, or the end of next week and the beginning of the week after, get more into the Dirty War and Operation Condor in Brazil and Argentina and stuff like that. Have a good one, and I will talk to you guys soon.